Hi, we're going to start in 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Volendo, tu puoi stare seduta qui.
L'iPad, così vedo. E muovo. Sì, ok.
Tanto in realtà sei l'unica che avrà le slide qui. Sì, perché lui non le usa come abbiamo
E quelli a
le abbiamo, poi
casa
c'è
quando
quello
condividono.
Sì. Sì, per 5 minuti. Poi non è connesso. Lo sto verificando sulla connessione.
Getting old and getting old.
No, no. I signed up.
Oh, come on. Well, I'll try my best to say it. Do you know the lady?
No, who is she? Ah, okay.
So many people.
Yeah.
Who is the boss?
So kindly take your seat as we're going to start. All right, then. So, good evening, everyone. My name is Pietro Manzelled. I am the research fellow at ADAPT. I'm very pleased to chair this last session of our international conference. The main title is Work and Its Value Today, an Interdisciplinary Approach. Two of the main speakers will provide a contribution online. So I think, without further ado, as time is always the enemy, to start with the first speaker, Professor John Budd from the University of Minnesota. He will provide this contribution online, and the title is "The Tensions of Valuing Work." Hello, John.
Hello, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, yes. Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Give me a second to share my screen. The technology is a little different, but hopefully it'll work okay.
Yep.
So I hate starting off a presentation this way, but you should be able to see my slides.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we can see you now.
Okay, great. So if there's any problems, just interject. Otherwise, I'll assume that everybody can hear me and my slides are advancing, etc. So it's a pleasure to be here. Of course, I'm really disappointed that I couldn't travel to be with all of you in person, but under the circumstances, I'm really happy to be able to participate in this way. As was said, the topic of my remarks here this morning or this evening for you, the tensions of valuing work. So I'll give you a minute to read this cartoon. Work can have very different meanings, as I'm sure different presentations have raised either implicitly or explicitly over the last couple of days. We all probably want to define what work means to us. And sometimes that's possible, but typically not completely, because none of us work in a vacuum, or very few of us work in a vacuum. And most of us don't have the power to completely define what work means to us, because there's coworkers, there's managers, there's power dynamics, there's markets, right? And valuations clash in society, in workplaces, maybe within even individuals. Right? And so who gets to define what work means, I think, is a really important question to think about when thinking about the value of work and the different meanings of work. Now, it's probably similar in everyone else's countries, right? But as we've emerged from the pandemic here in the United States, right, many businesses are short-staffed, retail, food establishments in particular, right? And there are signs everywhere, like the one here on the screen, right? Apologizing to customers, advertising for jobs. But, as with many other aspects of our society today, we have polarized views on work and polarized views on the short staffing issue, right? Consumers think that workers should just get back to work because they want their tacos or their coffee or quicker service. Some just think workers are lazy and they blame the government for extending unemployment benefits, right? So the value of work through those eyes might be self-sufficiency. People should be self-reliant, not just sitting at home, not cashing unemployment benefit checks. And of course, from that perspective, the value of work is also to provide goods and services to others. Right? But workers, of course, have their own values and valuations of work. And short staffing, of course, is due, at least in part, to fears of feelings of lack of control over safety conditions and things of that nature. Of course, many other issues. It's very complicated, right? But my central point here is that work has very different meanings. Work has very different valuations. We're in a polarized situation where these valuations and its meanings really sharply clash. And so my central claim here is that we need a careful, thoughtful, multidisciplinary approach to help us see these tensions more clearly and help us try to work our way through the conflicts inherent in thinking about the different value that work can have. So I've created a 10-part framework of different meanings of work. I think each of these, my claim is that each of these meanings of work are contained within various academic traditions or philosophical, theological traditions. Each forms a different sort of paradigm for how to think about work, and the meanings of work, the value of work, and with important implications for work-related institutions, practices, and other things. And I typically use this framework sort of as 10 different dimensions, 10 different meanings, and think about the implication of those meanings for different things. But I think here today, given the theme of the conference and the theme of this closing session, I think it's more useful to think about these, or think about how we can rearrange these into dualities, right? So by duality, I mean sort of paired connections, right? Dual obviously means two, so we have paired connections where there's a tension, but also overlap. And so, so there's this constant tension. And it's not just, we can't just have one without the other. They both derive meaning from each other, even though there's tension at the same time. Right, a long-standing important concept applied in many aspects. And so let's put these meanings, let's create some dualities from these meanings. And again, I think it's useful to see these as important pairs with tension, which meanings that's derived from understanding the other perspective. But we might want to be pulling in certain directions, but we can't always completely pull in one direction because of this tension, right? That's inherent in these dualities. And I think, again, what I'm going to try to hopefully make clear in the next few minutes is I think these dualities and thinking about the meanings of work in terms of these dualities is very useful in revealing important tensions for how we value work. And because we have these tensions and because we have a series of tensions, that just underscores how difficult it is to value work as well. So one duality I argue is between thinking about work as a curse and thinking about work as freedom. Thinking about work as a curse might be arguably the most long-standing way of thinking about work. You can see it in different ways. At its most primal, perhaps, it's just an unquestioned burden that we all have to endure simply to survive. There's also elitist views on work as a curse, where some people are cursed with sort of poor work, and this is necessary for maintenance of the social order. Now, opposed to that, we can see work as freedom, a way to achieve independence either from the harsh natural world in which we live, independence from other freedoms, independence from other humans. Also, we can think of creativity in this way as well. And so what does this imply about sort of tensions in valuing work? Well, if we see work as a curse, then the value of work is rooted in survival, rooted in stability, rooted in maintenance of the status quo, whereas we have this tension seeing work as freedom, where the value of work is more about autonomy and creativity. But again, we can't necessarily go one extreme or the other as much as we'd like. Better to see this as a tension. Now we have work as a commodity. This is very popular in economic thinking, mainstream economic thinking, right? Really making work into an abstract quantity of productive effort that has tradable economic value. There's going to be a number of dualities here with seeing work as a commodity. One very important duality is seeing work as caring, seeing work as caring for others. And so transitioning from the meaning to the valuing of work. When work is a commodity, right, it's all about economic value, and markets are at the root of determining value, whereas seeing work as caring for other really highlights the importance of non-commodified reproductive value of work, and really highlights the importance of moving past markets driving value. We can also see work as a social relation, which then the importance for valuing work is to see how culture and hierarchies and other sort of human institutions shape value, not simply markets. Markets, of course, being human-created institutions as well, but just a subset of these broader things. And then more in traditional industrial relations terms, we can see work as occupational citizenship. It's done by humans for more than simply economic purposes. And so this really highlights, along with caring for others and work as a social relation, all three of these non-commodified or strictly commodified views of work, right, highlight how values of work should reflect the humanity of work and the fact that work is being done by humans, not just sort of abstract marketplace participants. And so we have these tensions. And as much as we like to pull away from the market, right, we can't completely pull away from the market. And so we have these dualities, we have these tensions. We have a very classic tension. Now turning more to an individual level, we can see work as disutility, another mainstream economics way of thinking about work. Right, in mainstream economic thought, as I emphasize to my students here at the University of Minnesota, right, economists see work as something lousy, right? It doesn't bring utility. In fact, it's the opposite. It's a source of disutility. And the only reason that people endure this lousy activity is so they can get money to be able to get goods and services and things that provide pleasure or utility. We have a classic sort of duality here with more mainstream psychological thought, right? Seeing work as ideally being able to provide personal fulfillment. And so then we have this tension in meanings of work, right? Are we working just for the money? Are we working for more intrinsic rewards like satisfaction, self-esteem, feeling good about ourselves? And then lastly, we can think about work as a source of identity, right? It's not just fulfillment or satisfaction, but really a source of meaning, helping us understand who we are, where we fit into the world. Very individual orientation there on work. We can contrast that with work as service, which seeing work not solely for serving your own personal needs or the needs of a small nuclear family, but really seeing work as a way to serve broader households, multi-generational, broader households, a community, God's community, lots of different ways beyond sort of individually focused views that we can see work in service of. And if I throw into this sort of identity category, the and beyond part is other sort of very individual focused ways of thinking about work, which could be, working for money, working for my own satisfaction, all of these different sort of individually oriented ways of thinking about work. When we transition from thinking about meanings of work to how we value work, right? All of these different individual oriented meanings push towards individual oriented values of work. As opposed to thinking about work as service, we have community derived values of work. What is the benefit for a community of your work rather than the benefit to me as an individual? And again, my argument here is to see this as a tension rather than be able to go all towards one extreme, all towards the other extreme. So we have lots of different meanings of work. We have all these different tensions. But before I conclude, one last point I want to make is that I think I'll argue that there is what I'll call homogenizing tendency, and this is supposed to be an image of milk here, right? That homogenization is good for milk, but it's not good for thinking about work, right? But it's easy. Work is very complicated. We like to simplify things. We think of, what's the one meaning that work has to us? What's the one meaning that work should have to society? But I want to argue that we need to move beyond sort of this tendency to homogenize things, make things uniform, look for the single meaning of work, look for the single value of work, and try to recognize its complexities. Just quickly to sort of back up my homogenizing tendency claim here, I have a massive open online course where a big theme of that course is to try to get students to see the diversity of meanings of work. And yet, even in the context of where I'm really emphasizing diversity, I have students who then report things back to me, like the statements here on the screen. Money is the key driver. Large majority work for money. Most people work for personal satisfaction. Right? Again, we're oversimplifying. We're homogenizing rather than recognizing the complexities of work. So where does this leave us? I want to argue that there are significant tensions when thinking about meanings of work, values of work, and this isn't only at a societal level, but can be within an individual level as well. Right? Work is very complicated. Yes, maybe we're working for money, but we also hope that we have some creativity, some autonomy. There's some aspects that are not very pleasant. There's some aspects that are rewarding. Right? And so we don't want to oversimplify meanings of value of work, not only within society, but also within an individual. And again, I think it's therefore useful to appreciate the dualities rather than thinking about strict choices. We need to move beyond this tendency to homogenize work. We need to move beyond the powerful trying to have power over ideas and power through ideas, which again are trying to impose their sort of oversimplified personal views of work. A leader in my own university keeps telling staff that we lost our joy when we started working remotely. And so there's been a lot of battles with staff trying to force staff to come back to campus and work in person all the time, right? But it's this one leader and her views of work trying to impose on everyone else, and it's leading to lots of problems, rather than this leader recognizing the diverse meanings of work, the diverse values of work, and trying to reconcile that and work with that diversity. So we need a multidisciplinary foundation to see these tensions, to see this diversity, and embrace this complexity. Thanks.
Many thanks, John, also for being on time. I think we could leave questions at the end of the session, if you agree. So we can move quickly to our next speaker. It's a pleasure to have you here, Professor Manfred Weiss from Frankfurt University. He is going to talk about the legal preconditions for valuable work.
Well, good evening, everybody. As you can see, I stand here because people say with my size, it doesn't make a difference whether I sit or stand, and I prefer to stand. First of all, I would like to thank my friends for having invited me again. It's always a great pleasure to be here in Bergamo. And for me, it's a special pleasure because I used to be a very close friend of Marco Biaggi. And here they work for the legacy of Marco, and I'm grateful for that. Well, John Butt just told us that money is a key motivation for workers to work. I agree with him. But we also know quite well that money, remuneration, wage, however we want to call it, is only one element, even if a very important one, of valuable work. And if I say valuable work, I look at it from the perspective of the worker. There are many more dimensions. We could say, in general terms, that valuable work is work which respects human dignity, or which leads to job satisfaction, or with which the worker can identify. All this is correct, but it doesn't say anything, because it's much too general, much too broad. And therefore, I think we have to look what kind of subcategories are there which make work valuable. And from my perspective, I'm a law person, I want to reflect what kind of legal preconditions do we need to make work valuable. Of course, I cannot give you a comprehensive list, otherwise we would sit here until midnight, and I'm told I only have a few minutes. But I will give you some examples. I will not talk about examples which everybody talks about and which are highly regulated already, as for example, the prohibition of discrimination or the guarantee of workers' privacy. These are, of course, basic elements of valuable work. I will look at some aspects which are not so much in the limelight, but which have turned out to be extremely important, in particular in these times of transformation of work, as we see it all the time in the period of digitalization and decarbonization, and which also has proved to be relevant and important in this terrible pandemic. Well, let me first take an aspect which has turned out, if you look through the literature, to be extremely important. For workers, work is valuable, and this is an element, an important element of it, if they get the training to be skilled enough to really cope with all the challenges of the work, not only using, for example, technology, but being able to appropriate technology. And this is very difficult because it means that we have to adapt all the time to the changes and challenges of what's happening today and in the future. And this means lifelong learning for all. And I stress for all, because as you may know, the recent report of the ILO Global Commission on the Future of Work tells us there is continuous learning, there is continuous training, but for the happy few. For those who are already trained, they get even more trained, and the rest gets nothing. And this is something we can't have in the future, and we will not have valuable work for many, many people. Therefore, the challenge is lifelong learning for all. But this raises many, many questions. The first problem is, how do we organize the access? Do we get an individual right to each worker to get such training? Or do we work with incentives? Not only for workers, but also for employers, because they sometimes are also quite reluctant in this respect. This is very difficult. And then the next question is, how shall we share the costs? Who shall pay for this? And there the Global Commission had a wonderful idea. They suggest a so-called employment assurance, not unemployment insurance, employment insurance, where all contribute and where then it might be easier to finance all this. And let's be honest. This kind of training is also something which is not only valuable for those who get it, but for the society as such. And therefore the question is, why do we not pay it by the tax system? All these are questions which are totally unresolved. Then, of course, the question is, when shall we get this training? During working hours? Shall be there specific sabbaticals? All this is not yet decided. As you can see, and I would like to make this point, de-skilling and the need for reskilling of workers are the characteristic phenomena of modern working life, and the needs of a comprehensive strategy of continued training is evident. Labor law has to significantly reconceptualize all the concept of training, but this is only in an embryonic stage so far. Let me go to the second aspect, which I would like to mention. And this is, and you may say, well, there's nothing new, this is banal, job security. But if I talk about job security, I talk about the possibility of worker, which makes his work valuable, to plan one's life in a mid and long-term perspective. This means that we not only should focus on protection against unfair dismissal, of course, that's important, but it's not the only thing. Even if I should mention that unfortunately we have neglected that, because since 2 decades we have a new philosophy which is no longer talking about job security but about employment security. It's not important to keep your workplace, it's important that you get a smooth transfer to another job. That's not wrong, that's quite a good idea, but it should not be to the detriment of job security. And I'm not only staying with job security, I also would like to mention that we should be careful, much more careful, to have fixed-term jobs, because fixed-term jobs are dramatic for the workers, because the worker not only knows, I don't know what's happening afterwards, but the worker is inclined to do everything what the employer wants in order to get a job. And this kind of behavior then is not something which increases the solidarity between the workers at the workplace, and this leads to enormous conflicts. Therefore, forget about fixed-term contracts. They only should be there as an exceptional tool, not as a regular tool, in my view. The same is true for temporary work, with the temporary work agencies. If I look at this directives we have on fixed-term work and on the temporary agency work, they, in my view, are not the right way to deal with these problems. We have to be much more restrictive. I want to be not misunderstood. I'm not saying we should prohibit fixed-term contracts, and I'm not saying we should prohibit temporary work. I only say we should be much more careful with it and should be much more restrictive, which unfortunately is not happening. Well, a next element which I would like to mention, which was mentioned in all kind of workshops today, is the possibility to organize a decent work-life balance. And there, of course, we could think of many basic elements which might lead to that kind of goal. I only would like to mention one. And the one I would like to mention is there should be more internal flexibility, as I would call it. What do I mean? There should be an easy way for workers to change from full-time to part-time and from part-time to full-time. This, of course, creates problems. It creates problems of remuneration, it creates problems of pension, but I think it's very, very basic. Since in my country, in Germany, we have the possibility to go from full-time to part-time and from part-time then back to full-time, and to have a right to do this, which only in exceptional cases can be refused by the employer, things are much better than they were before. Well, and there, and now I come to my favorite area, the working time, which was also dealt with several times today. On the one hand, there is no doubt, working time flexibility. That's what the workers want. And on the other hand, the possibility to full, and here I mean mental and physical, detachment of work. To have nothing to do with work, to just have free time. Well, since in many workplaces nowadays, it's much more important to achieve goals than to be present in the company. Of course, the time frame has got a very new meaning compared to what it was before. And of course, workers are interested in having lots of autonomy, yeah. And this, of course, is particularly true when you have homework or something like this. But the big question is, do we really have to get away from maximum time, daily maximum time, weekly maximum time, rest periods, breaks, and all these kind of things, which were made because to guarantee and save your health? Because if we give too much autonomy, this autonomy is dangerous, it's ambiguous. Why is it ambiguous? Because as we see from many, many cases now, in particular, we have learned it through this pandemic, the danger is self-exploitation. And therefore, I think we need clear-cut rules that the working time has to stop sometime every day and also at the maximum level in the week. Of course, if you are sitting at home and you have your computer, it's very difficult to stop or to not answer the phone when you are phoned by the employer and so on. Therefore, what we need is, and we have it already in quite a few countries, we need cut downs of the systems, which of course cannot be done everywhere. Imagine, the pandemic will tell you what it would mean if you would have such a system in a hospital, then this would be a catastrophe. We can't do it everywhere, but it's a first step, and we have to think of mechanisms which might combine the need of flexibility and the need to have maximum levels in order to preserve your health. We have no solution so far. It's very, very difficult. Many people are thinking of this, but it's very necessary to find something. If I talk about health and safety, let me make at least, I could talk for hours now on health and safety, which I don't do, but let me at least make one, or give you one example, which in my view is very important and which we have learned how important it is through this pandemic. If I speak to people, and I do it quite often, who work in the healthcare system in my country, and I ask them and I say, well, if you get more money, will you be happy? And they say, well, you have no idea. Money is not so important. For us, it would be important to have a possibility to breathe, a possibility to really do something for the patient, to not be all the time on stress. But we can't do it because we don't have enough people. It's just not possible to do it anymore. And therefore, I think what we really badly need, and I know how problematic it is something for which in Germany we have a wonderful word, which I cannot translate in English. I haven't found a translation. It's called Stellenschlüssel, which means, I explain what it is. It means that you have to have a certain minimum amount of people for performing a task. Only then you can make sure that people can perform their work and their tasks in a dignified way. But I have to tell you, from a legal point of view, this is relatively easy to put in paper, but it might remain law in the books. For example, one of the lessons we learned in the pandemic was to have such a mechanism for the people in the healthcare service. But the problem is, in the moment, we would need more than 100,000 people, to just meet the lowest level of these standards. We don't have these people. The other way around. More and more people are leaving the healthcare service because the conditions are as they are, and they have nothing to do with money. So you see, it's very problematic. And how much time do I have? Oh, he's strict. But you know, as a German, I tell him all the time, have to be stricter, you know. So I have to behave. Okay. Well, the last thing I would like to tell you is, and what for me is basic, is something which already the founding fathers of labor law understood as essential for a dignified and valuable workplace. And that's a democratic workplace. And what do I mean by democratic workplace? I mean that there is not unilateral decision-making by management, but there is a possibility for workers to influence management decisions, be it by information and consultation, be it by vetoes, be it by co-determination, whatever it is. But it is important that workers do not have to feel being an object of those decisions, but they have to feel being a subject of influencing these decisions. And in so far, work is also a school for political democracy in society. It's very, very important. And I tell you, it was never more important than now. Because we are, as I already said in the beginning, we are in a transformation phase where we have to meet all kinds of new challenges which might be burdensome for workers. And this needs lots of acceptability. And you only will get this kind of acceptability if you can give the workers the feeling that they have a say in what is happening here, and it's not only a unilateral decision by management. These were only very few examples of where I think we need legal instruments to make sure that all this can happen. Much is to be done in this area. And let me close by saying, not everything, of course, can be legally regulated, which is important for workers to make work valuable. Let me give two examples and then I stop, I promise. First example, workers are very much afraid of having work which is too monotonous, which is always the same. They want to have some variety. This, of course, is something which human resources people should think of. It's not something for us law people, you know. And the same is true for the other example which I would like to give. Having spoken in my long life to so many workers, you know, they always tell me, I would like to know what the worth of my part is, what I do in relation to the end product or to the end service which is provided. This again is something which could be provided by an intelligent and fair human resource management, but it will not be provided by law. In other words, what I told you were a few elements where I think law can play a role, but there are many others and much has to be done. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Manfred, for your insightful presentation or speech, as you would like to call it. So next is Professor Valeria Feliz. It's a pleasure to have you here. She's a full professor of labor law at the University of Udine, and she will deal with an interesting topic, the value of women's work between gender gap and gender equality.
First of all, First of all, I want to thank Professor Tiraboschi for his invitation at this prestigious international conference. And I have also to thank all the staff of ADAPT for the welcome and the organization. I'm honored to be here to learn from such distinguished colleagues and to share with them and with you some ideas. I chose to talk about a topic that is extremely significant for me, the value of women's work. Work is not something neutral. Okay. In history, in the present, worldwide, work and its value have a gender. There are so many gender-based differences in everything concerning work, labor markets, and jobs that is unavoidable to bump into the issue of sex and gender discrimination. Talking about women's work and its value, it is necessary to underline that both concepts have been deeply changing during the last century. It is a matter of fact that women's work was considered of lesser value than men's work. And in some countries spread in the world, it is still considered of lesser value than men's work. This belief was or is based on another assumption, that women are worth less than men. We should not forget that the Treaty of Rome in 1957, in the Article 119, provided for the principle of equal pay for male and female workers for equal work or work of equal value. Of course, the expression of equal work is easier to understand than work of equal value. Later, the Article 119 was amended and now is more complex and really articulated. But I want to focus on the origin of this rule. And the reason of this provision was not related to fundamental rights, equal opportunity principles, and so on. Not really. The reason of this provision was related to the fact that in some of the European community founding states, especially in France, the principle of equal pay for equal work was already in place, in force, not yet in many other states. So the advanced countries were worried of social dumping practices. If female wages are lower than men's ones, especially in manufacturing sectors in which women are more than men, the prices of goods could drop dramatically. This episode is meaningful because economic reasons pushed the founding member states of European Community to achieve the gender equality. 70 years later, we are still talking about gender discrimination, gender gap, and gender equality. Each member state of European Community previously and European Union now has carried on its legislation on the road of gender equality. In 70 years, many factors contributed to changing things. The cultural perspective, less male-dominated, the commendable work of European Court of Justice, the growth of a new generation of jurists and legal experts with a new approach of sex and gender relationships. Traditionally, the benchmark, the model for lawmakers, regulators, was the white, heterosexual men, in Italy also Catholic. Let me give you an example. In the Italian Civil Code, the Article 2110, currently in force, places pregnancy and motherhood at the same level as the illness or the injury of the worker. The Italian Civil Code was issued in 1942, and pregnancy was considered like an accident, a disruptive factor. Pregnancy, motherhood, these are other two key words. The capability to give life was considered, in a lot of cases, is considered a negative quality, a factor of discrimination, something that decreases the value of female human beings and their work. What a paradox, what a nonsense. Only from the 70s, in many European countries and European institutions, politics, lawmakers, courts focused on the value of motherhood, not only from an individual point of view, but also from a collective point of view, a value for the society. Previously, protections were given to working mothers, later to working parents, moving the focus from motherhood and women to parenthood, so both parents. Children have not only mothers, but fathers too. Finally, also for the European Community directives and national legislators. Now the attention is shifted on work-life balance instruments, and as Professor Tiraboschi said before, work-life and health balance instruments. Work-life balance measures represents the only way for working women in Europe to reach the gender equality. And that's not enough. I want to underline that this is a big issue, because if women don't work, if they are forced to choose between children and work, they don't make babies. It is a matter of fact. The fertility rate, the birth rate is dropping in many European countries. In Italy, is dramatically low. On the other hand, the European population is getting older and older. Employment policies, welfare policies are strictly related to family policies. For women, work means economic independence, personal growth, self-realization, choice and chance to have babies. Yesterday was the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Violence is based on biases, stereotypes, discriminations. Violence has not only physical or psychological forms of expressions. Economic violence is violence. Economic violence against women is violence against women. Gender wage gap is a form of violence. The road to gender equality is still long. Legal, economic, and cultural measures and instruments are essential to reach the goal. I want to make the last example. In the specific context of research organizations and higher educational institutions, the European Commission considers a gender equality plan as a set of actions aiming at achieving gender equality. And to adopt a gender equality plan is become compulsory for universities if they want to get money from Horizon Europe program. It will be an eligibility criterion for all public bodies, higher education institutions, and research organizations from European Union member states and associated countries wishing to participate in Horizon Europe. Once again, after Treaty of Rome, the economic motive could be a driver for a just case. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Professor Philippe, for this interesting contribution. I think we can move on. And now it's time to present Professor Morlicchio from the University of Naples. And she will deal with a main contribution, which is the value of work, who is the boss.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and I apologize for speaking in Italian, but I didn't know that I was in a session with all the English people speaking. And io non posso anche io che ringraziare di cuore per questo invito, perché non capita sempre l'occasione di poter partecipare a convegni con un approccio interdisciplinare come questo. Ringrazio per la ospitalità e per la perfetta organizzazione. E mi scuso anche col professor Schreck perché non ho ascoltato la sua bella relazione introduttiva, perché ero in viaggio appunto per raggiungere Bergamo, ma ho letto con molta attenzione il saggio che ha citato anche ieri Ilaria Armaroli, scritto con Dukes e pubblicato sul Journal of Law and Society, e io a questo saggio farò riferimento. Se può, ecco. Dunque, il tema di questo convegno è un tema importante perché mette insieme due termini fortemente polisemici, il lavoro e il valore. Io me la sono cavata appellandomi a un'alta autorità in materia, cioè Humpty Dumpty, quanto Alice nel Paese delle Meraviglie, gli chiede: ma se le parole possono avere diversi significati, chi decide qual è il significato da dare alle parole? E Humpty Dumpty risponde: bisogna vedere chi comanda, which is to be master. Quindi io non andrò alla ricerca del padrone dei termini lavoro e valore, perché significherebbe per me inoltrarmi in un ginepraio, e il mio contributo è un po' più circoscritto, ed è quello di cercare di mettere in luce, di riportare, anzi potrei dire alla luce, quello che Isaac Rubin, che è considerato il più importante studioso del suo tempo della teoria del valore in campo marxista, ha definito il lato qualitativo sociologico del valore. E qui la citazione è tratta da un suo saggio del 1928 che è stato poi ripubblicato da Feltrinelli a metà degli anni 70. E cerco di andare più lentamente per la traduzione, anche se consumerà un po' di tempo. Questa dimensione sociale dello scambio salariale di cui parla Rubin non è stata sempre tenuta in debito conto, devo dire neanche dai sociologi, perché spesso abbiamo sempre un po' questo complesso di inferiorità nei confronti degli economisti, e questo ha dato luogo ad una sorta di riduzionismo economicistico contro il quale si scagliava, a mio avviso giustamente, lo storico Edward Thompson quando analizzava i food riots nell'Inghilterra del Settecento, e Thompson osservava che noi conosciamo tutte le abitudini, tutto il delicato tessuto di norme e di scambi sociali che regolano la vita degli abitanti dell'Etobrian. Qui il suo riferimento era agli studi di Malinowski, ma dice Thompson, a un certo punto quella creatura sociale infinitamente complessa che è l'uomo melanesiano si trasforma nelle nostre analisi nel minatore inglese del XVIII secolo che si batte convulsamente le mani sullo stomaco e risponde soltanto a stimoli economici elementari. Ecco, con questa rappresentazione caricaturale Thompson ci invita, secondo me, a guardare all'operaio salariato, anche se lui si riferiva al minatore inglese del Settecento, non soltanto come a un homo economicus, cioè come un individuo isolato che tende a massimizzare le risorse scarse ai fini del raggiungimento dell'utilità personale, in questo caso specifico appunto della sopravvivenza attraverso un salario. E questa rappresentazione dell'homo economicus noi sappiamo che era già rinvenibile da Adam Smith e poi è stata ripresa da John Stuart Mill con la sua formulazione di Economic Man, e poi ha trovato una ampia diffusione sia tra gli economisti mainstream che tra gli antropologi economici di impostazione formalista. Ma questa visione, secondo me, ha in qualche modo un po' anche influenzato i sociologi e forse in parte anche gli stessi giuristi del lavoro. A questa visione riduttiva si è opposta quella ben più complessa di Hannah Arendt, a cui Adap ha dedicato sempre molta attenzione, però se interpreto bene anche il suo pensiero, Hannah Arendt riservava solo all'azione una dimensione sociale che invece negava sia al lavoro che all'operare. E questa dimensione sociale invece si ritrova in una maniera, secondo me, esemplare negli scritti sia giovanili che nelle opere economiche della maturità di Karl Marx. Anche se noi tendiamo sempre più a soffermarci sulla sua rappresentazione degli effetti della mercificazione e quindi diciamo del lavoratore libero, adesso non sto a ripercorrere tutte, no, la duplicità dell'essere libero, che si confronta con l'imprenditore in un rapporto che è di tipo contrattuale. Ma Marx ci mostra chiaramente come non è in gioco soltanto questo tipo di compravendita, non è solo in gioco la ricostituzione del capitale energetico, e se vogliamo riferirci a una economia della conoscenza, un capitalismo della conoscenza, il capitale intellettuale del lavoratore, ma qualcosa di più che riguarda le condizioni stesse della mercificazione del lavoro. Condizioni che appunto possono essere limitate sia dalla reciprocità, sia dalla redistribuzione e dalle istituzioni collegate, come ci ricordava prima Michele Tiraboschi. E quindi l'importanza che Marx attribuiva non solo agli effetti della mercificazione che appunto spingono il lavoratore a vendere la sua forza lavoro, ma le condizioni stesse della mercificazione, secondo me, emergono in una maniera esemplare. Poi Marx per me è un grande scrittore, quando lui prende in giro il povero signor Pill nel 25esimo capitolo del primo libro del Capitale, che aveva fondato una colonia nell'Australia occidentale portando con sé il capitale lavoratori, quindi portando con sé tutte le forze produttive, ma una volta arrivata a destinazione si era accorto che non c'era nessuno al suo servizio disposto a lavorare per lui, perché non aveva potuto portare con sé la realtà dei rapporti sociali di produzione che erano un prodotto storico delle trasformazioni dell'Inghilterra in quel tempo. E quindi Marx dice povero signor Pill. Quindi nella costituzione delle condizioni sociali che rendono possibile la mercificazione hanno svolto un ruolo importante le leggi sui poveri. Io sono partita come studiosa del mercato del lavoro, ma mi occupo ormai da alcuni decenni della povertà e quindi ce la devo mettere per forza le leggi sui poveri, che però, come fa notare lo stesso Polanyi, di fatto Polanyi parla di misnomer, cioè lui dice chiamare quel sistema di regolazione, che è un sistema di regolazione del lavoro, col termine leggi dei poveri, è un po' una mistificazione, perché sin dagli esordi delle leggi sui poveri facevano parte lo Statute of Artificer del 1563, l'Act of Settlement e via di seguito. E del resto Oliver Twist, che Dickens nel suo romanzo qualifica come un parish boy, se ricordate bene, fu mandato a lavorare presso un fabbricatore di bare, quindi a dimostrazione dell'intreccio strettissimo che esisteva tra l'essere povero assistito ed essere un apprendista. Qui apro e chiudo una parentesi, per questo io non mi scandalizzo di quella che è stata definita la torsione lavoristica del reddito di cittadinanza, perché un po' fa parte della storia proprio delle leggi sui poveri, e questo lo dimostra per esempio anche tutta la storiografia sulla legge dei poveri. La diffusione del rapporto salariato, la creazione delle condizioni di mercificazione non sono solo il risultato di quello che Barrington Moore Jr. non ha esitato a definire una violenza di Stato, ma anche di un sistema di regolazione che questo lo spiegano molto bene secondo me Hoff e Leonard in un piccolo libretto, che ha consentito di stabilire chi e per quanto tempo poteva essere dispensato dal offrirsi sul mercato del lavoro. E quindi in questo modo regolando le condizioni di riproduzione sociale, non solo lo scambio lavoro contro salario. E per Hoff e Leonard questa decisione non poteva essere lasciata soltanto ai bisogni individuali e familiari o alle possibilità di sussistenza esterne al mercato del lavoro, come vorrebbero in quest'ultimo caso appunto i teorici del basic income, ma doveva essere regolamentata giuridicamente allo scopo di scoraggiare il ricorso a modalità alternative di esistenza e di legittimare la condizione del lavoratore salariato come condizione normale di esistenza. Quindi ne consegue da tutto questo che il rapporto di produzione che lega l'operaio salariato al capitalista non si iscrive soltanto all'interno di quella mediazione monetaria specifica che chiamiamo salario e che sappiamo equivalente al valore della forza lavoro per il tempo del suo utilizzo. Ed è interessante che sia proprio un giurista del lavoro come Michele Tiraboschi nel suo libro Persone e lavoro tra tutela e mercato a ricordarci che il lavoro non è una merce da affidare al solo diritto dei contratti. Perché come abbiamo visto appunto fa anche leva per esempio su dei regimi di giustificazioni che possono essere anche esterni al rapporto contrattuale di scambio e che consentono di trattare la forza lavoro come se fosse una merce. Quindi la compravendita di quella che Polanyi ha definito una merce fittizia non è semplicemente un contratto atipico di natura economica che si realizza sulla base dell'interesse razionale rispetto allo scopo, quindi esaurendo i significati dello scambio nella contingenza del medesimo e nell'esito della transizione. Esso è a tutti gli effetti uno scambio sociale tra soggetti posti in una posizione di potere differente e Gino Giugni si spinse a definirlo un rapporto di dominio occultato dal contratto. Quindi il valore del lavoro in quanto oggetto di scambio è incorporato nel significato della relazione e questa è vincolata o mediata da norme e istituzioni, come ci ricordava Thompson. Se ho ancora 2 minuti vorrei fare proprio un esempio su questo, riprendendo anche l'idea di occupational community di Lipset che appunto Dukas e Stretch riprendono nel loro saggio, riformulandola in questo modo come social bonds among workers in the same occupation or workplace, which produces sustained, strong and enduring beliefs regarding fairness and justice at work. Va bene, io 2 decenni fa ho fatto una ricerca su delle piccole imprese nell'agro sarnese nocerino, cioè nel mezzogiorno d'Italia, e mi sono imbattuta in un caso molto interessante di una impresa che produceva cucine, aveva l'80% del mercato in Cina e l'imprenditore mi disse io potrei anche delocalizzare in questo momento, per me sarebbe molto vantaggioso perché questo mi consentirebbe di passare su una scala medio-piccola, su una larga scala, ma non lo faccio perché nella mia azienda il contabile è mia cognata, il falegname è il mio maestro dal quale io ho imparato come si fanno le cucine perché ho fatto l'apprendista da lui e l'altro lavoratore è mio fratello. Quindi se io delocalizzo questa azienda, questa produzione, o costringo tutte queste persone a trasferirsi in Cina oppure io le butto in mezzo a una strada. Quindi vediamo come questo, diciamo, per noi meridionali è stato sempre una cosa quasi naturale, prestare attenzione a questo, diciamo, alle regole informali della produzione, ma oggi è un aspetto quanto mai importante perché pensiamo per esempio anche è stato citato prima anche la questione del suicidio. In Italia durante la crisi del 2008 noi abbiamo avuto un numero elevatissimo di suicidi tra gli imprenditori e perché hanno vissuto anche la crisi della loro azienda con un senso di fallimento proprio nei confronti dei propri dipendenti. Allora bisogna chiedersi il potere datoriale o manageriale incorporato nelle piattaforme, quale responsabilità si assume nei confronti dei lavoratori. E qui ho trovato molto interessante la proposta di Tiraboschi e con questo concludo che bisogna quindi spostare questo senso di responsabilità forse all'esterno anche del rapporto di lavoro e di cominciare a tematizzare come diritti universali di cittadinanza, perché questo forse può garantire un'applicabilità a situazioni così eterogenee tra di loro. Grazie.
Thank you very much, Professor Morlicchio. Let's move on to our last speaker, who is also providing his contribution from across the pond. So let's welcome Professor Supriya Ruth from the University of Victoria, Canada. And he's going to talk about the legal imagination of a social relationship idea of work. Professor Ruth, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pietro. Am I audible? Just a small nod.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Pietro, could you please remind me at 13 minutes that I have 2 more minutes to go?
Yes,
and I'm hoping to share my PowerPoint I'm not sure if that's accessible to you all or not. Okay, so I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to say again that I'm going to offer something new. This has been discussed, and particularly John Budd mentioned this, as well as Manfred Weiss. I'm talking about social relational idea of work, and what I'm going to offer is I'm going to offer an evidence to corroborate the social relational idea of work. Well, before we go on with the PowerPoint slides, I first wanted to thank the organizers. And after hearing from Manfred West how beautiful Bergamo is, I am jealous not being there. And buongiorno e tutti. That's the only Italian I know. And good morning from where I am sitting today. So my thesis for today's talk is the following, is that although there is a political acknowledgement of work as social relational, the legal conceptualization of work is stuck in the past. So that's my general thesis. And I'm going to talk about, I'm going to offer as my evidence the essential services that's been categorized both under the labor relations regime as well as the emergency services regime. And I'm going to draw on evidence from Canada, more particularly British Columbia, because in Canada, labor relation is provincial. So therefore, every provinces would have their own labor relations law. So just to give you a little context, the British Columbia Labor Relations Code of 1996 seeks to balance essential services with job action, that is, right to strike and right to lockout. So the essence of this law is to strike a balance between these two. And then the Supreme Court of Canada in 2015 said, essential services are those services whose interruption would endanger the life, personal safety, or health of the whole or part of the population. Mere inconvenience does not make something an essential service. So once essential service is declared, what happens is that, pardon me. Thank you. So the Labor Relations Board investigates the threat to health, safety, or welfare and designates certain services as essential. What happens in this declaration is the labor relations regime moves from the private contractual basis to the public relational aspect of labor relations. And why I'm saying that is for the following reason. It has to be suggested by the minister. So the Labor Relations Board will consult with the minister of the government and then only declare that there is an essential service. And that essential service cannot be interrupted because work must go on irrespective of whatever happens in the labor relations regime, in the private contractual regime, that is, irrespective of whatever is happening between the trade union and the management, the work will have to be performed. That's what the labor relations regime says. And then there is another regime. If you could move on to the next slide, which is the Declaration of Essential Service under the BC Emergency Program Act of 1996. And this declaration was made during COVID, because COVID, as we all know, is an emergency, has been categorized as an emergency. Now, why I'm drawing my evidence from this BC Emergency Programs Act rather than the Labor Relations Code is for the following reason. Well, the Labor Relations Code works on a particular logic. It works on a contractual logic between the trade union and management, whereas the BC Emergency Programs Act, since it's not essentially a labor relations statute, I expect the law to tell me what really work is without having to put work in a particular legal framework. Thus, I think it's valuable that we draw lessons from other legislation that sees work in a particular way. So let's see what the BC, under the BC Emergency Programs Act, what has happened in here. Under that law, essential services are those daily services that are essential to preserving life, health, public safety, and basic societal functioning. And emergency means when there is an imminent danger, imminent event happening, or the circumstances mandate that everyone needs to coordinate their work. And this emergency could arise from forces of nature. And then again, under this law as well, wide range of powers are given to the minister of the government during an emergency. Could we move on to the next slide, please? Now, the list of essential services as to after COVID had happened, what ought to be declared as essential must be decided by the minister of the government, and then it would have to be discussed with provincial health officer, and then all these services must remain open. And what I'm going to show in the next few slides, those slides are not for readability purpose. I don't expect anyone to read these slides. I intend these slides only to have an effect on you. You don't have to read this, because what I intend to show you, the range of services that has been declared essential. Now, health and health services, as Manfred was earlier mentioned, health services, the folks particularly during an emergency, folks tend to self-exploit themselves in health services. So health and health services were included. The next slide, please. So was law enforcement, public safety, first responders, and emergency response personnel. These are all different categories of workers who are included under the general category of law enforcement. The next one, please. And then you have the vulnerable population service providers. These workers provide services to the vulnerable population, howsoever they are categorized. Next one. And then you have workers offering critical infrastructure. Next. Food and agricultural service providers. Next. Retail sector. Next. Transportation. Next. Industry and manufacturing. Next. Sanitation. Next. Communications and information technology. Next. Financial institutions. Next. Other non-health essential service providers. And again, I told you, you don't have to read the slide, but I can tell you this much. I appear in this slide. Educational services, including services by university professors, are categorized as non-health essential service providers. So in this sense, I am an essential worker under these declarations. Could we move on to the next slide, please? Now, could you think of any service, could you think of any worker that has been excluded from those categories, from that declaration of essential, as to the services that must remain open so that the society could function properly? Well, I could not. I could probably identify one or two tourism-related work that are not related otherwise to health or some other transportation or some other category of work. But except for certain rare categories of work, I thought every work was included in the declaration of essential services. And this is decided by the minister, by the public, therefore, by the government. Now, these essential services, this comprehensive list of essential services, are essential to the preservation of life, health, public safety, and basic societal functioning. And why the rationale for public intervention in these services? These services are all performed as part of contractual understanding between workers and employers, or in collective labor context, between a trade union and the manager. If private contractual basis is the rationale for all this work to be performed legally, conceptualized legally as private contracts, what is then the rationale for public intervention? The rationale is the imminence of an event or circumstance, that is emergency, because it requires prompt coordination of action or special regulation. Now, urgency is something, could we move on to the next slide, please? So urgency is something that triggers public intervention and otherwise a private contractual relationship. However, if for a moment we forget that urgency triggers public intervention and thereby moving what otherwise legitimately belongs to the private contractual exchange to a public relational aspect, if we move urgency from it, the entire reasoning is based on the idea of social crisis. Because if these work are not being done, it will result in a social crisis. In view of this formulation, therefore, the primary function of the list of services enumerated under Emergency Act is their social contribution. At its core, work performed to offer these services are therefore social relational. The market relational nature of work as contractual exchange, and I'm talking about an employment contract here, whether that employment contract is seen as an individual employment contract or a collective employment contract between a trade union and a management, it's a mere technical imagination of work that has become part of the labor relations regime. Now, labor relations regime cannot move without that technical framework because it has become so integrated in our legal imagination. But if you look at other legislation, it sort of gives us what work really is and how we should evaluate and understand work. If we could move on to the next slide. Thus, I'm going to suggest the following chain of inductive reasoning. If the emphasis of essential is core need of the society or the public, then essential means socially necessary work. Now, from the list above that I have taken through all those slides, you could see that most work, I would even argue, if I wanted to be really provocative, that all work equals to essential. They're all essential work, and thus they're all socially necessary. Next one, please. If essential, therefore, means socially necessary work that includes, I'm drawing on the list, all work or most work, and if essential results in social regulation or public intervention in working relationships, shouldn't, by deduction, all work or most work be regulated socially? That is, all work or most work is socially relational. Therefore, regulation of work, all work or most work, on the list, you will draw your own conclusions. I'm suggesting regulation of work must be akin to something that's called public law. It doesn't have to be a replication of administrative law or constitutional law, but regulation of work ought to be conceived as a part of public law, not equaling to private law of contract, even if modified contract. And we all understand that even when employment relationships are based on contractual relationships, there is public intervention in bits and pieces in employment law. But what I'm suggesting is that the public intervention be central to the idea of regulation of work. Thus, labor law ought to be the law of social contract with a limited role for private contractual relationship. Can we have the last slide, please? Oh, no, I have one more. And so I wanted to mention, in spite of this recognition that essential work is almost every work and therefore they're socially necessary, from 2001 in Beyond Employment, Supio had, and Supio's colleague had noted that what the courts are trying to do is being innovative in interpretation. And in and around 2021, we see the exact same thing with respect to the Uber jurisprudence in Europe, in North America, and elsewhere in the globe, that the idea of the court is merely to interpret and bring Uber drivers as employees. So everyone is engaged in interpretive activity rather than conceptualizing. Thus, I'm suggesting in the next slide, that drawing on the following authors, drawing on Hannah Arendt, work is human interaction with nature or socioecology. Then I'm looking at Carl Polanyi, If work is fundamental human condition, according to our end, then market exchange of labor, that is employment contract, only offers a narrow frame of reference to visualize human interaction. And then I'm drawing also on Supio, saying that membership of the labor force ought to be the structure by means of which we look at legal relational aspects of work, social relational aspects of work. And I'm suggesting that if membership of the labor force should be the lens by which we legally see work, it could only be visualized in its relationship to the society. Because when you have a broad category such as membership of the labor force, it could only pertain to the society. Labor law, therefore, or more broadly, and more attracted to this idea of regulation of work, then should be the law channeling social responsibility towards workers. I will conclude with those points and then look forward to the discussion that might ensue. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Professor Ruth. I think there is room for some questions. Any questions, observations? Yeah. Too shy? Tired, probably. No questions? Could you come here?
Hi, everybody. I'm Margherita Roiatti, Senior Researcher in ADAPT. First of all, thank you very much for your insightful presentation, your contribution to our conference. I was willing to leave in the floor to other also PhD students, but they are, I think, too shy or too tired this evening. So I'd like to address a question to Professor Philly, since I really appreciated her presentation. Since I'm really concerned also in gender equality and gender perspective when analyzing labor market dynamics and also other issues, namely also the ones linked to the skills imbalances as women presence in some different sectors of the economy. As for your opinion, studying these issues, which could be an instrument, a tool which could be used to enforce principles which are already included in the Fundamental Treaty of the European Union since 70 years. So which could be a new, maybe, or a different way to improve gender equality, not only at work, because we are aware that gender equality impact on the equality in this society, in the sustainability of the society, and also in all the aspects concerning working lives. So which could be something which could be further implemented or a new tool at all for ensuring equal conditions, equal pay for equal work. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think that we have to separate the situation of Northern European countries and Mediterranean countries. So I want to focus, for example, on the south of Europe and especially Italy, because there is a very big difference in the welfare system and welfare services. I think that services related to childcare and also aging people care and older people care are really important in improving work-life balance, and so they, for me, are a key to let more women enter in labor market. In Italy, we have a system in which our welfare state, welfare with the W as a capital letter, is based a lot with a welfare with a little letter, because the welfare is based on welfare in the families, and families are focused on the work of women. In a lot of situations, it is an unpaid work, and women are in front of this dramatic choice, children or work. So I think that more services related to childhood and also older people, elderly people, are very, very important. For example, our school system is based in a vision in which we have 3 months of vacation, holiday. Is something that I think is not related to the today's society, the current society. I think that for families and also for a work-life balance, also for men and women sharing the work and family, the family work duties, it could be important to have these services guaranteed all the year long. So I hope that in the PNRR, when the government talks about inclusion and equal opportunity, will think about this deep gap that is in our system, in our country. I don't want to talk about the gender gap, the gender wage gap, because it's a very complex situation. But if you notice, in Italy, we have a lot of collective bargaining. So we have not the problem of the value of 1 hour, working hour. We have the problem of the part-time. We have the problem of the difficulties for women to enter in the labor market. So I think it's related to this welfare services system.
I also would like to add something to this question, which is really a very important one. There is a mechanism which many people don't know it. You know, in the beginning, when we had the first, and this was in the 70s, the first directive on equal treatment of men and women, there was a rule which still exists, that you may differentiate between men and women if the sex is the precondition for the job. And the member states were forced to present in regular intervals a list. What kind of jobs are these? And I can tell you, in the beginning, this list was tremendous, also of the countries of northern Germany, northern Europe, not only of the south, you know. Nowadays, this list is very small. You have only actors and fashion models. That's about it. For the rest, you can forget about it, you know. And this shows you, if there is public pressure on the member states, they don't want to look as bad boys and bad girls. And therefore, they do something. There is pressure. And you know, the most important judgment in this context of the European Court of Justice is the following. It's an English case. And there was a guy who wanted to be midwife. And then, of course, the British courts would say, no, 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 this doesn't work. You have to be a woman to be a midwife, because this is very delicate, and women don't want men around and so on, you know. Then it came up to the Court of Justice. What did the Court of Justice do? He asked a brilliant question. The Court of Justice said, why can midwives only be women, but gynecologists also can be men? And then it revealed why. Because gynecologists earn a lot of money, whereas midwives, this is a job for poor people, you know. And here is the real problem. But this has led to the fact that also midwives now can of course be men, you know, which means that if you put pressure on and in that time the Commission was very strong, you know. Whether the Commission would do it nowadays, I doubt it a bit, you know. I'm not so sure, and I'm not so fond of our president of the Commission, who comes from Germany. Well, I don't want to go into that, you know, but there has to be done quite a bit, and there can be done quite a bit if we have enough fantasy and if we have courage. And fantasy and courage is getting more and more seldom, you know. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, probably we have one more question. Okay.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Someone called for a PhD candidate, so I came here. And I would have a question for Professor Weiss. I really appreciated your intervention, very inspiring. And, you know, I really enjoyed your example from the medical care systems. And, you know, I think that when we think about how many people we need for doing a work, for doing some task, yeah, we are considering some issues of economic efficiency for the company. And, you know, in my opinion, economic efficiency is very important, because if you have not resources, you cannot use them for care for people. But at the same time, I am wondering to what extent economic efficiency should be needed, because, you know, profit should have a limited weight. Yes, and maybe a weight for hospitals too, but a limited weight for economic activities. So when we think about the regulation of work at the workplace, I think that we should wonder about what is the value of a company, of an enterprise too.
So we take last questions.
Okay.
For you. Thanks for you, so we can.
Yeah.
You can respond.
Very briefly, just a couple of points for you, Manfred, because you said that we need to restrict the use of temporary work, fixed term contract. But do you think this the real answer to the changing nature of labor? Because in Italy, we have tried to restrict the use of fixed term contract. The answer was the abuse of training experience, like internship and so on. And the second question that is really connected is, I agree a lot with your picture, your speech, but the legal precondition for valuable work for you are all inside the contract, not in the labor market. Is right, your position. First of all, we have to think to people inside the company. You said participation inside the company, the framework of protection inside the contract, but for all people outside the labor market, outside the company, outside a regular contract. So maybe it's not necessary today to build, also from a legal point of view, a framework to protect people, not only contracts. Now, and this way, I think, as labor lawyers, we need to think more not to the rules, but to institutions. Maybe I believe a lot in trade unions and industrial relations because it's a concrete answer from people and institutions to protect employees. Thank you.
Just a second. I think that Professor Ruth has to go now. So Professor Ruth, yeah, I think he had to go. So I would like to thank him to join us.
Thank you very much.
Yes, yes. I hope to see you here in person next time.
Oh, absolutely. I look forward to that. Thank you. I have to
Thank you very much.
class now.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I think I answer the other way around. I start with your last question because I fully agree with you. I only took some examples, and you are quite right. I didn't take external examples and I didn't talk about institutions. Since you know me for a while, you know how much I'm, let's say, estimating the institutions like collective bargaining, like employers associations, trade unions, etc., etc. It's taken for granted, and you are quite right. We have not only to look at the relationship in the internal employment relationship. We have to look at the labor market and its institutions. You're quite right. What I did, was to take a few examples from this inside perspective because this is the easiest to understand. I didn't want to make it too complicated since I only had a few minutes. So you're quite right. I agree with you. The temporary work problem is difficult, I tell you. If I look at the statistics we have now in my country, in the pandemic, the fixed term people and the temporary agency people, these were the victims. Because, it was the easiest to get rid of them. And this, of course, happened, And therefore, because this effect is always possible, we had it already in the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, And if this is something to be expected, we have to make sure that this is to be limited as much as possible, because this, of course, increases the fears of these people. And if you speak to these people, be they in fixed-term contracts or be they temporary agency workers, many of them, not all, the highly skilled, for example, temporary workers, they are not a problem, I'm talking about the lower skilled, And these people do have terrible fears that there could be again a sort of crisis, and then they are the first to be out, And therefore I say we have to think what kind of mechanism can we find to limit this kind of pattern, be it fixed term or be it temporary worker. That's all I wanted to say. Well, yeah, your question, where is my friend? Here. Your question, of course, is a crucial one. First of all, it goes without saying that economic efficiency is important. Yeah. And of course, we always have to find a balance between economic efficiency and the regulation, no doubt. This is actually the task of labor law since the beginning. The problem we have, and we have had it in particular in the last 3 decades, was that according to a philosophy which is called by many people neoliberal philosophy, whether that's correct or not, I leave it out. We had the following pattern, and unfortunately the European community played the game also. If you look, for example, at the Lisbon strategy or the strategy 2020, you will see it, which means Economic efficiency is the basic goal. And labor law regulation is a sort of disturbance of the free market, and therefore labor law is only a residual category which can exist if economic efficiency is not touched in any way. This, of course, is no pattern. And fortunately, the European Union has changed its perspective, last not least, with the pillar, the European pillar of social rights. This is the European pillar of social rights. Whether it's binding or not is not my problem. My problem is that I'm happy that there we have a concept, an autonomous concept of social policy, independent of economic considerations. So we have, let's say, the two mechanisms. We have still the macroeconomic governance, and in the macroeconomic governance, you have still efficiency as the primary goal. But now you have on the side a social program on equal footing. And this is something totally different from what we had in the European Union for quite a time. And if you come to the health sector, I'm not, of course, there also economic efficiency plays a role. But I'm asking myself, in particular in what I have learned through this pandemic, whether really it is a good idea to privatize healthcare. I don't think so. I don't think so. I think this is a public service to be organized in a way where economic efficiency doesn't play a primary role. And this is actually a sort of, how should I say, lesson, which at least in my country, I don't know how it is here, but in my country, it's learned by more and more people. There is more and more pressure to make sure that, now I'm exaggerating, not the money, but the patient is in the first place. And we have just got a new treaty on the coalition for the new government in Germany. And there, you can find lines in this direction. Whether it will end up in real politics is a different question, but at least the indication is there. In short, I'm not sure whether privatization of healthcare is a good idea. I stop with this.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I think that we are coming to a conclusion. So first of all, I would like to thank you all the speakers. Thank you, Professor Budd from the United States. We hope to have you here in the future.
Yeah, thank you. I look forward to that.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the speakers again. So I think this is the end of our international conference. Before concluding, two more points. The first one is, I think we need to also appreciate the work of those working behind the scenes. So thank you to all the staff who worked now for this international conference, particularly to my colleague and friend Margherita Roiatti. And on a more personal note, I think it's only fitting to remember two friends and colleagues who are no longer with us, and they had been a constant for the Adapt community, Lorenzo Pelusi and Malcolm Sargent. So I look forward to see all of you next year, and yes, I think we can call it quick. Thank you very much.
Thank you.